past the clouds, over the dark night. She reached up to the sky of stars and caught the red-hot light of the North Star.
Good afternoon, and as always, welcome back. There was a very interesting piece posted on Facebook a few days ago. The author of the piece was recounting an experience he had 26 years ago in South Africa. He was having lunch with a white South African scholar at Wits University in Johannesburg. She'd been recommended to him as a progressive and one of the good whites, as they can be described. Over her salad, he peppered her with questions about racism, one after another, until about 20 minutes in, she raised her hand as if to tell him to stop and admonished him thusly, quote, "Young man, you seem to be under the impression that the biggest problem facing post-apartheid South Africa is racism. It is not. It is sexism and the patriarchy," end quote. Really? How can that be? Let's connect some dots and find out.
Connecting the Dots with Dr. Wilmer Leon, where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge.
Welcome to the Connecting the Dots podcast with Dr. Wilmer Leon, and I am Wilmer Leon. Here's the point. We have a tendency to view current events as though they occur in a vacuum, failing to understand the broader historic context in which most events take place. During each episode, my guests and I have probing, provocative, and in-depth discussions that connect the dots between these events and the broader historic context in which they occur, thus enabling you to better understand and analyze the events that are impacting the global village in which we live. On today's episode, the issue before us is, well, let me connect a couple of dots in today's discussion. The Washington Post reports today, at the outset of an extraordinary Oval Office meeting, President Trump criticized South African President Cyril Ramaphosa for the treatment of white Afrikaners, saying it would be a primary topic of their conversation. How does this tie in foot, using accounting terms, to the reality that my guest understands? He's an author, two-time Pulitzer Prize finalist with more than 20 years of journalistic experience. He's a former Washington Post bureau chief and award-winning foreign correspondent on two continents, as well as a former radio and television producer of Chicago Public Media's This American Life. He's a Knight Fellowship recipient and the author of Class War in America, How the Elites Divide the Nation by Asking, Are you a worker or are you white? He is none other than my dear brother, Jon Jeter. As always, welcome back.
Thank you, brother. I'm almost impressed with myself to hear you read off my resume.
Well, you should be, because it's quite an impressive resume with a litany of accomplishments, and you know better than I. I only scratched the surface. So what brings us to this conversation was my response to your Facebook post regarding your time in South Africa. And as I stated in the open, I told about the white woman that was recommended to you as one of the good whites. So first of all, explain what that means, because it may seem obvious to most, but that is a contextual and nuanced reference. Jon
Yeah,
Jeter.
that's a great point, actually. I'm not sure I would have known what it meant before I arrived in South Africa. She was a woman who was tied to the anti-apartheid movement, not someone who supported apartheid, a progressive. And if I may say, I'm only half joking, but there's some truth to this. Um, white Americans and white South Africans used to joke about whose blacks were better. Were our blacks better, or were your blacks better? South African whites are better than our whites. And what I mean by that is there is a history of struggle. The Communist Party has always had a very big footprint in South Africa, and the progressive whites, while there's still there's still some privilege attached to being white in South Africa, even if you're a progressive. Many of them seem to understand the issues a lot better than our whites do. Redolent of the new left, maybe of the 60s, right? Or maybe, to put it another way, they were more influenced by someone like a Joe Slovo, who was the head of the Communist Party in South Africa, a white man, Jewish man, I believe. He and his wife, who was assassinated, Ruth First, were stalwarts of the anti-apartheid movement and moved in lockstep with the Black freedom fighters like Nelson Mandela and Oliver Tambo, assisting them often, right? Taking directions from them, which maybe it's the point I'm really trying to make, is that many of them, not all, but many of the white progressives in South Africa who were allies of the anti-apartheid movement, unlike the whites here in the United States, particularly with SNCC and the New Left, they understood that the movement should be led by blacks. And maybe that's giving them too much credit, because there's 80% of the population in South Africa is black. So that was a no-brainer or a non-starter for them. But in any event, this professor, whose name I still cannot remember, I should go. She's probably retired now, but I could probably find it. But she was recommended to me as one of the ones who really understood the issues facing post-apartheid South
Well,
Africa.
hang on. Let me just Google a good white woman in South Africa and see what I get. I couldn't pass up that joke. Go ahead.
Yeah, no. So she was. I have to say I was impressed with her. Not initially, as you mentioned, but I was impressed with her. And I should say this as well, because a lot of people mistook the post as me arguing for the kind of liberalism, white liberalism or feminism, that in the United States means that black men are blamed for everything that goes wrong. That's not what she was arguing for. She was arguing for a feminist notion that, much like Samora Machel, the late Mozambican liberation hero and first president, argued for, a notion in which women needed to be liberated from patriarchy, just as blacks need to be liberated from settler colonialism. She did not talk about the struggles of white women in South Africa, only to the extent that I remember she said, she's the first person to say this, and it stuck with me. She said, really, because this was 5 years after the first election in 1994, this would have been 1999. She said, really, the people who have benefited most at this point from the end of apartheid are white women. And she meant that ironically. She meant that, like that wasn't a good thing. So, yeah, she was, I thought, I wish she could almost give a speech to whites here in the United States so they could see this is what a real ally looks like. And I'm sure she wasn't perfect, but still, she was, if I may quote Margaret Thatcher for the first time, she was someone that we could do business with.
Now, you're telling that part of the story brings a couple things to mind. One is you're saying that, according to her, that the largest beneficiary of the end of apartheid were white women, and that makes me think of the benefit as we look at the small business development program that the government had in place started by Richard Nixon. That as we looked at the numbers from the program that was targeted to bring more African American and businesses of color into the government, the largest beneficiary of that program was white women, white female small business owners were overwhelmingly the beneficiary of those programs, the small business set aside programs and those kinds of things. It also makes me think about the a quote from Frantz Fanon, who talked about, I think it was White Skin Black Mask, either that or Richard of the Earth, who where he talked about when a colonizer runs up against an enemy where women have decided to engage in the conflict, that you have just found an enemy that you cannot defeat, particularly in a patriarchal society, that when women pick up arms, you might, as the oppressor, you might as well pack it up and go home, because those folks aren't going to quit. Yeah. And the other thing that comes to mind is from Dr. King's Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community? As you were talking about the difference between white South Africans in the freedom struggle versus Dr. King's assessment of white liberals here in the United States, he writes from Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community? For the vast majority of white Americans, the past decade, the first phase, and he wrote this in 1964, had been the struggle to treat the Negro with a degree of decency, not of equality. White America was ready to demand that the Negro should be spared the lash of brutality and coarse degradation, but it had never truly committed to helping him out of poverty, exploitation, or all forms of discrimination. The outraged white citizen had been sincere when he snatched the whips from the Southern sheriffs and forbade them more cruelties. But when this was to a degree accomplished, the emotions that had momentarily inflamed him melted away. White Americans left the Negro on the ground and in devastating numbers walked off with the aggressor. It appeared that the white segregationist and the ordinary white citizen had more in common with one another than either had with the Negro. Exactly. And so that came to mind as
that King was a pretty smart fellow, wasn't
he? He, every now and then, like what they say, even a blind squirrel can find another forest sometimes. So and another thing that came to mind was a conversation I had with Tom Porter yesterday when he was explaining to me that early in the civil rights movement in the 40s, it was the Communist Party, and you're talking about the communist element within South Africa, that it was the Communist Party that was so far backing the civil rights movement. Mm-hmm. But he said that what developed out of that, in one of, if I may tell this story from his perspective, one of the issues he had with that whole dynamic in the Communist Party of the United States was racism.
It's no question. I wrote about this in my book, Class War in America, that there was a school in Moscow started by Lenin right after the Bolshevik Revolution, and then he died. But in the first few years, they trained Black revolutionaries like, I believe, Paul Robeson's best friend, Patterson, the lawyer.
James Patterson, yes.
Yeah, several other people.
Genocide.
Yeah. Several other people, Blacks, who were instrumental in the New Deal, the labor organizing movements, the Scottsboro Boys movement, were instrumental. And the Communist Party International, vibing off of Lenin's ideas, wanted to create a revolution, a worldwide revolution, but a workers' revolution. And they did, in a manner of speaking, invade the United States in 1931 with the Scottsboro Boys case. They came in, they organized Blacks, they intended intentionally, deliberately to lift up the Black voice, because Blacks were the largest casualties in the stronghold of Western capitalism, right? The Deep South in the United States. And they did, and they started this movement, this synergy between blacks and white communists, many of them Jewish. You want to understand why the Jews were so hated, both in Germany, right, where Hitler hated them because they were one non-white and two communists, right? But that synergy was here in the United States, and it really kind of ruled the day for really a generation, I would say, till after the World War II. And whites, even many of the communists, started to sort of slowly retreat back to this white identity as opposed to a worker's identity. So that's very true. And you will find a lot of those same people, many of whom actually went to Moscow to the school of the toilers, I think it was called, that in the 60s and even the early 70s, they didn't give up on communism as an idea, but they gave up on communists as people because they felt that the communists had betrayed them too largely. So yeah, even the communists, I think, who I don't think it's fair to say that they are as bad as capitalists, but even the white communists betrayed blacks in a myriad ways. But there's still, I think, something to be learned from that lesson going forward, which is that we can work with whites as allies as we go forward, but blacks need to understand it's very likely, almost certain, that whites will at some point, once we've won higher ground, whites will at some point retreat into whiteness, go back to their white identity. So there's something valuable in that experience that we had with the communists and the Jews, many of them Jewish, for really I'd say 25-year period, beginning in around 1930, 1931.
So getting back to your piece and the statement by the woman that you were having lunch with, where she was very clear to tell you, you seem to be under the impression that the biggest problem facing post-apartheid South Africa is racism. It is not. It is sexism and patriarchy. And then you go on to say that when you heard that, and I'll put words in your mouth, you thought she was tripping or crazy.
Right.
But then you came across this book by Samara Michelle, and that opened your eyes. How so?
Samora Michelle, the assassinated, probably still assassinated by South African apartheid forces in South Africa in 1985, I think. The leader of Mozambique, their liberation struggle, and their first president. I found a book with his speeches, and the speech he gave on the celebration of their liberation in 1975 from the Portuguese colonizer, repeated almost verbatim what that white woman professor in South Africa told me, right? That he urged his people, the Mozambican people, coming off this, 25-year struggle against 25-year civil war against the Portuguese colonizer. He urged them to now turn their attention to lifting up women, freeing women from the oppression that men visit upon women. That women needed self-determination every bit as much as black people did under Portuguese rule. It was stunning to me because he was saying what this white woman had told me. I didn't believe it, although I listened. I think I can't remember everything she said.
That was going to be my next point. Was that because this is something that a lot of people need to understand.
Yeah.
In fact, if I can quickly, unless you know what I wanted how you described. I know where it is. How you described your. You said I didn't believe a word she said, but to my credit, I listened, really listened, and I interrogated what she told me and thought deeply about it. And as I proceeded, I found that many Africans repeated what she had told me. Kudos to you, and unfortunately, not enough people do that.
Yeah.
Jon Jeter.
I mean, part of it, I think, is my makeup as a black man. We love to grow, right? That's what it means to be an African. We love to grow. we'll grow until we die. And so I did listen because, I recognize she might, there's a poem that talks about that, Desiderata, I think, listen to even the dull-witted, because even they have their stories. I thought this woman was dull-witted, right? But I listened, and partly, too, as a journalist, right? I thought, if nothing else, journalists should always listen, right? And so I did listen, and I learned from her that day. And I left that lunch thinking, well, something I'll think about. But I was 34. Some might argue it's still the case, but certainly then I thought I knew everything. And so, but as I researched, and I did, again, I think I don't think that experience speaks well of me in its entirety, and that I was so dismissive, I was so ignorant of, and not totally. I understood the women, as Kimberly Crenshaw describes, have a unique set of oppressive factors that determine their lives. But I didn't understand the extent to which, I to this day, I don't know if I would agree that sexism is as important as racism, but I will say that, and this is what Samora Michelle was saying, they're intertwined. You can't really deal with one without dealing with the other.
Mhm.
That the patriarchy, certainly as we understand it in the United States, derives from the slave plantations, where white men thought they had dominion over everything on that plantation. Blacks' labor, women's sexuality, the animals, they thought they had dominion over everything. And so if you understand that as the cornerstone of colonization and oppression, then it really allows you to go forward in a way where you're dealing, you're if I can use Kimberly Crenshaw again, you're intersecting, you're you're connecting the dots, right? Between racism and misogyny, patriarchy, and what's going to free all of us.
I'm glad that you highlight this, because again, in talking to Tom and his highlighting, in the 40s and the 50s in the United States, that racism was a big problem within the party. We can look at the LGBTQ community in the United States, and one of the big issues that I've had with because a lot of activists in that arena, they love to compare the plight of the LGBTQ community and the African Americans' freedom rights struggle, ignoring the racism in that community. And even when people, into your book, to the title of your book, are you a worker or are you white? You talk about a class struggle, but the question within that class dynamic is racism.
No question. No question.
Jon Jeter.
No question. What you have to understand, and I think this is what white South Africans understood better than most white Americans, even leftists and progressives, is that it's all about the class struggle. That's true, right? The employers and the employees, the bosses and the workers. But racism was created to divide and conquer.
Right.
It created from an exploited class of workers a super exploited class of blacks. And you might be able to argue some other people too, but really it comes down to the hatred of black people, because this demonization of them to split the movement apart. Because when blacks and whites get together, as we saw in apartheid South Africa, we see here in the civil rights movement, the New Deal, when blacks and whites get together, that kind of interracial coalition, that energy, it's not that we win every fight, but we are to the 1% what kryptonite was to Superman, right? When we come together. So they understand they have to stop that. The problem is that much of the left, and they understand it, I think, in a subconscious way. Like, I don't think Donald Trump really knows this history, right? But he has inherited it from his time with Roy Cohn, who did understand it. People like Roy Cohn, and maybe his father, I don't know, but he inherited this worldview from people who told him, we've got to stop white people from having solidarity with black people, because that we can't stop that. Or at least it's very, very hard to stop that once it gets going. I just don't think that most white leftists understand that. So we see constantly. I wrote about on my Substack just the other day about a podcast I saw with Norman Finkelstein, who I admire very much, when he's talking about Zionist politics, the Israeli occupation. I think he knows more than almost anybody alive when talking about Zionism and what motivates it and how it moves. But man, when he starts talking about identity politics and DEI, I mean, it's almost like walking into an insane asylum and listening to somebody, espouse, wax poetic about, racism. It's just it's incoherent completely. So yeah, that it's a tough spot. Again, though, I do hold out some hope that, much like we did during the Great Depression at the nadir of the Great Depression, that we can sort of turn on a dime very quickly. There will be enough white people who realize, oh, we need to start talking to black people again and stop blaming them, because clearly they're not the reason, for the genocide in Gaza. They're not the reason that the workers only take home 42% of the pay. And maybe we should start working with them. I'm hopeful that will happen sometime very soon, because I do think that we're staring at an economic catastrophe, which of course always breeds political catastrophes.
I was trying to find, while you were explaining it, I was trying to find on my bookcase so I could hold the book up. Edward Baptist has a phenomenal book. The Half Has Never Been Told, Slavery in the Making of American Capitalism. Phenomenal book. And he lays out in that book the point that you're making, how the industrialists and the elite at the end of American enslavement wanted to be sure that the newly freed enslaved African would not unite with that poor white, or else that was going to be a coalition that they were not going to be able to manage.
Mm-hmm.
And
he also,
go ahead.
I'm sorry, go ahead. Well, he also lays out that the patriarchs, the slaveholders, the big plantation owners, saw the plantation as their sexual playground, right? Getting back to misogyny and patriarchy, he thought he was entitled to the sex from any woman on that plantation. So it's all part of a piece.
And it's quite a serendipity, I guess we might say, that you posted the piece when you did, because, as I just talked about in the open, South African President Cyril Ramaphosa is at the White House, and the headline, and this is a pretty consistent headline, Trump confronts South African president over violence against white farmers. The president made no mention of the African nation's longstanding epidemic of violence against both white and black people, nor its violent and discriminatory history of white rule. He amplified Trump's false claims that white Afrikaners have been victims of genocide, even showing video of crosses and earthen mounds that he said represented more than 1,000 grave sites of murdered farmers. The grounds were, in fact, part of a protest against the violence, not actual graves. John, I watched the whole press conference, and I really saw this. One of the motivations behind this I saw was really a juvenile attempt by Trump to discredit South Africa's claims that an ICC case about Israel's genocide in occupied Palestine by saying, look, mommy, don't blame me. Billy's doing it too. Jon Jeter.
Yeah, I have so many thoughts about that. First, I interviewed Ramaphosa when Ramaphosa was one of Nelson Mandela's top aides when he was released from prison. He was a labor leader. He lived in Soweto. Everyone loved him. He was the ANC would take a poll of their most popular figures for years, and I do believe that in the years right after Mandela's release, or right before, that Ramaphosa finished second or third, maybe right before, or right after Chris Hani. Very popular, and people thought he would succeed Mandela as the president, but he took another route when basically he was outmaneuvered by some other politicians within ANC to become Mandela's deputy, and he took another route, which probably was fortuitous because he became essentially the richest black man in South Africa, and maybe probably one of the richest black men in the world by becoming the front man for all of these black empowerment firms that had to hire blacks as the head of their businesses, corporations, kind of a front man. And so he became very wealthy. I think he's closing in on $1 billion as we speak, and went on to become the president finally. And he's been a bit of a disappointment. I dare say. I should say that the story that I interviewed him about was a story about class in South Africa and how blacks were saying that they had been deserted by a cadre of ANC members, not all of them, but many of them who had deserted them, who had basically gone for the money, and they had deserted the poor blacks and working class blacks. Of course, that was what the anti-apartheid movement was about. So I interviewed Cyril Ramaphosa about this because his name kept coming up, although not in a critical way, just saying that we used to see Cyril all the time, and now we have to make an appointment with the secretary, and he seemed very touched by that, really kind of hurt. And I felt bad for asking him, but it was, it's a journalistic question. And in any event, he's gone on to become a little bit of a disappointment, I think it's fair to say, to many of the working class black South Africans, in that he's not really done enough to redistribute wealth. This land reform program, for instance, a lot of it is because a lot of the land reform efforts are written into the new constitution. He could seize land, but he just hasn't done it because he's very market friendly, and he's been very reluctant. The ANC has been very reluctant to seize land without compensation, which they can do by law. And it's just land really that is fallow. The land is not, it's lying vacant. There's a lot of land that's just not, they're owned by whites, but they're not doing anything with it. They're not farming it or anything. So there's that, and that I'm a little bit disappointed in Ramaphosa in that he has not really been a forceful advocate for South Africa's poor. And I was afraid that he, when I saw Trump ask this question, I was afraid that he would once again kind of come up short. I'm not sure that he did. I think he actually did a pretty good job. I would have wished he had done a little bit more, been a little bit more aggressive. But I thought his answers were pretty good for the most part. This idea of white South African farmers being killed is a myth, and it's really insulting to the history of South Africans who, the South African farmers who are killed often are some of the most vicious throwbacks to apartheid in the way they treat their workers, the way they treat people. And so it just isn't happening. And so I think Ramaphosa did a pretty good job of making the case. I might have done a little bit, I might have suggested a little bit better case in being forceful. And here's why. What Trump is doing is going to backfire, particularly in tandem with everything else. Mm-hmm. This is going to backfire miserably. You just don't do this to people. You invite people, and I have no sympathy for Zelensky, but you invite heads of state to your country, and then you
ambush them.
You ambush them like this, right? First of all, it's a lie. So I don't know how you think. Did he think Cyril Ramaphosa was going to sit there and say, "Well, you're right, Mr. President. We have a big problem with that, and we're working on it"? It's not true. There's no truth to it, right?
Well, in fact, wait a minute. In fact, because to that point, Trump starts talking about these Afrikaner farmers being murdered, and then Ramaphosa kind of looks at him quizzically,
right,
and he says, "Where you get that from?"
Right. Where are the bodies?
And Trump says, "In South Africa." Dude, you're making this up.
Right. Now,
go ahead.
where there is a genocide, we all know because we see it every day, right? Is a few miles due north in Gaza. Now, we know that's a genocide. You ain't said nothing about that,
Right.
But the thing about it, and I almost wonder. I guess he couldn't have, but I almost wish Ramaphosa had said, "Look, man, this is crazy." He said, "But I tell you what, I can guarantee you that within the week, I'm going to be having a conversation with Xi Jinping, right? And he's going to be telling me, see, I told you that that white man crazy. See, you need to do more business with us." That's what's going to happen. That's what's going to happen to the rest of the world. Who now is going to come to the White House with any sense of confidence or trust, right? I don't think Trump understands what he's doing. This is really sabotaging the entire global system of foreign affairs, of foreign affairs, in a way that really damages the reputation of the United States. I mean, this is South Africa is a member of BRICS, right, which is an expanding global bloc of nations that are in opposition to the United States. How do you think Lula is going to look at this now? How do you think, India and I mean, all these countries now look at this and say, oh, so it really is this is a new game we're playing. There's a new sheriff in town, right? And so this is a very, very bad scene. I will say this, though. I do want to hear what South Africans, particularly Black South Africans, but also white South Africans, say about Ramaphosa's response. I wonder if they wanted something a bit more aggressive and robust, because this was outrageous what he did. You just don't do that. You don't. Trump thinks he, he thinks he's invincible, and I think he's very soon to find out that he is not. All of this stuff is really, it's going down in a ledger somewhere. And I every day I'm of the belief that Trump is not going to finish out his term. He just has no support. Well, soon he will have no support at the rate he's going.
In watching that exchange, and I'm glad you mentioned BRICS, because there were I took away two competing narratives from the visit. Trump was trying to use Ramaphosa as the stooge to support this narrative about genocide in South Africa. And again, I believe Trump is doing that as a way to diminish the effectiveness of the South African argument as it relates to Israel.
I agree.
And I would have so that was the Trump narrative in the conversation. Ramaphosa, he brought a female, a woman who's the president of the labor unions in South Africa. Mm-hmm. And she was making the point, and Ramaphosa made the point as well. This is not an issue of racism. This is an issue of poverty. And they were making the point, the woman who was the labor leader made the point, there are Black women, elder Black women in villages that are being brutalized by Black people. This is not a matter of Black, and they were basically saying, ignore what's his name? I wrote it down here. Julius
Malema. Yeah.
Malema and Jacob Zuma. They were saying, ignore that, because that's not they aren't articulating South African policy. So ignore them. In fact, when I heard them say that I equated them to what's the white cat from Mississippi that ran for president, the head of the Klan?
From Louisiana, right?
Right, from Louisiana.
I know you're talking about. I can't remember.
Right. So I equate what Malema and Jacob Zuma are saying. I mean, they're fringe to a certain degree.
To some extent, yeah.
Yeah. And so they're saying, no, man, don't get wrapped up in this. And ironically, when you had the Charlottesville issue, with the skinheads and the neo-Nazis, Trump was down with them.
Yeah.
When you had the Proud Boys storming the Capitol, Trump was down with them. So it would have been a wonderful thing for Ramaphosa to turn to Donald Trump and say, help me understand the differences between there are good people on both sides according to you,
Right.
and what these folks are talking about there.
I should say though, Malema and Jacob Zuma, who was the former
David Duke
president,
David Duke is who I was.
Yeah. I would say though, their messaging resonates with particularly young South Africans. Their message, Zuma has some issues from when he was president that have to do with corruption, have to do with his relationship with some very young women. Not rape, I don't think, but inappropriate, I think people thought. Malema, I think, is a very powerful speaker and has a constituency, a very real constituency, particularly in places like Soweto. But there's something about him, and I don't know what it is, that he's also often claimed he wants to be president. It doesn't seem like that's going to happen. So I guess I'm saying his messaging resonates, but he doesn't seem to resonate with the South African body politic as much. So I do think that's true. And Ramaphosa knows it. They are on both Zuma and his party, the MK, which is an abbreviation of Spear of the Nation. I can't pronounce it. Umkhonto with Sizwe, which is the what we would call a terrorist organization here in the United States, formed by Mandela in the early '60s to fight apartheid. And then Zuma, his Economic Freedom Fighters, which is the Communist Party, their message resonates. But having said that, I just think there was so much. I thought Zuma did a pretty decent job of saying this didn't happen. And he was ambushed. He couldn't have been expecting this. So I thought he was quick on his feet to say, no, Mr. President. I think he could have taken it farther, though. I think it might have been helpful for his people, because there's a nationalist. South Africa, all countries are proud. South Africa is particularly proud, both black and white. And this thing with Trump did, particularly on the heels of the Afrikaners coming here as refugees, is not going to go down well. So I think he had space to take it a little bit farther and saying to Trump, this is not acceptable, bro. This is not acceptable. And so I'll end by just saying that this is an inflection point, not just for America, but I think for South Africa. What happened today is really, and there have been several inflection points, beginning with the elections in 1994. I think this is another one. I think we're going to see South Africa become a much more aggressive spokes country for leaving the orbit of the West.
And to that point, I would have because the other element that the South African delegation was bringing, and they kept trying to get back to this point, was economic development.
Yes.
That we need investment from the West so that we can create jobs in our country, because it is poverty that is causing the violence. And it would have been great for him to say, and that's why we joined BRICS, man.
Right.
I would have loved for him to have made that point. I mean, you've got to me, particularly in a factual basis, when you find yourself being victimized by somebody like Trump, you gotta hit him back. You don't have to use any bluster, any bravado. Just speak the facts and then watch him back up. And in fact, to a certain degree, you almost want to entice him into the fight.
Yeah.
To make him look like the clown that he is, John.
Right. Yeah. And I was thinking too about, while you were speaking, another thing, Ramaphosa is really compromised, very much like Ted Kennedy during the Anita Hill hearings. Ramaphosa is compromised in that way. Not that he's had any kind of history with women that we know about, but about 12 years ago, there were miners who were striking in South Africa, black miners, all black miners, a British-owned mining firm in South Africa. Think about that, which, of course, is the standard that Europeans own the mines in South Africa, the mineral resources. Miners went on strike. Cyril Ramaphosa at that time was a board member, and there were emails that were found where Cyril Ramaphosa was basically, I mean, Orwell would be like, get out of here, right? He couldn't imagine it, but Cyril Ramaphosa was urging the mine owners to take aggressive action against these strikers, and they ended up killing, I want to say like 30, 35 of them maybe, just basically went and opened fire on these mine workers, black mine workers. So there's something going on there that I think in some ways might hold Cyril Ramaphosa back from being as aggressive as he'd like to be. But the other thing I just think is important to mention, because people, I would have known this had I not gone to Africa, lived there for a few years, but and I haven't been there in 15 years. But when I went, I'm a big coffee drinker, and when I went to American firms to buy my coffee. I don't think a Starbucks is there yet, but Seattle's Best and all these American coffee firms. And when I first lived there in the early aughts, I am notoriously cheap and usually broke, but I went to South Africa and I thought, well, I'm gonna buy some jewelry for this woman I was dating because it's supposed to be cheap in South Africa, right? They mine it here, so it must be cheap. And I went and I bought her a ankle bracelet, and I won't say how much I paid for it. I was working as a post, so I was inward rich, as we say, at that time. And I gave it to her, and we were in South Africa when I gave it to her, and she said, "How much did you pay for this?" And I told her, what the exchange rate was, and she said, "You could have got this cheaper at home, right?" And I didn't realize that, but she was right. And the reason why is South Africa, they mine the gold and the jewelries, right? But then they send it to Antwerp to cut it. And then they send it back. The money is made in the cutting, not the mining, right? And so what they're doing with almost all of the goods in Africa that are the natural resources, the fruits, there's no, I don't know if it's changed, but there was no coffee roasters in Africa when I was there 20 years ago. I don't think there is now. There was no one who could cut jewels in Africa. I don't know if there is now. All these raw material resources were being shipped to England and Europe and the United States.
Through De Beers.
Yeah, right. Through De Beers, right.
De Beers controls the international diamond market.
And De Beers ain't African, right?
No.
It's just,
not
by origin anyway. And so this is the problem. Colonialism intentionally, deliberately blocked the development of an economy, an industrial economy, a value-added economy. It's a term we don't use here much in the United States, but everyone in Africa and Europe knows adding value is where the money is. And that's what does not exist in Africa. We're seeing, and this is why I pray for him, but I think he's going to be all right, Ibrahim Traore in Burkina Faso, because he understands that. And from what I understand, this is a game changer. They're making electric cars in Burkina. This is a game changer, right? Because what's going to happen, I do believe, is that everybody else in Africa, the African street, maybe not so much the Ramaphosa's, but the African street is going to be demanding, well, if they can make cars in Burkina Faso, which is actually one of the poorer nations, even by African standards, why can't we make, laptops here, right? Why can't we make so? And that, I think this is going to be a game changer. So again, back to my point, I think this moment that we saw, it's very hard to trace movements, transformation, social transformation back to one point. But I think a few years from now, when we look back, we're going to see this moment today, this exchange between Cyril Ramaphosa and Donald Trump in the White House as a moment in which Africa awakened.
Well, and to that point, I've written a couple of pieces where I've discussed that rarely do you know you're in the moment during the moment.
Right.
Usually it takes some historic time in reflection to say, oh man, that was a game changer.
Yeah, that's right.
I've said in a couple of these pieces that I've written, we're in the moment now.
We're in the moment. That's true.
And because Charare has changed the cotton production.
Yes.
Where they used to export their cotton, now they are taking raw cotton and turning that into fiber, turning that into a textile. He's changed their rice production because Burkina Faso, I think is how they refer to themselves. They were not as adept at rice processing, and so they preferred foreign rice to indigenous rice. That is changing. Their gold production is changing. They're creating their own. They're building nuclear power plants so that not only they can provide power to Burkina Faso, they will be selling power. So when you're in Niger and you turn on the lights and the lights stay on.
Right.
Another element of this is cocoa production in Ghana. I think it's Ghana. They are processing their own cocoa or cacao, I think is how it's pronounced.
Yeah, that's right.
So there are we're seeing a number of shifts in dynamics. And we mentioned De Beers, and let me just quickly make the point that to show folks the dynamics of this international scheme, we have come to believe that diamonds are rare. They are not. It's really a matter of controlling the market. De Beers controls the market. You cannot sell a diamond on the open market that De Beers does not sanction.
Right.
Russia has in vaults in basements of the Kremlin, they got bags and bags and bags and bags and bags and bags of diamonds that they can't put on the market because De Beers controls the market. It's a matter of supply and demand, and De Beers controls the supply. And a lot of this affinity for diamonds has come from Hollywood and film. Diamonds are a girl's best friend and all of this kinds of stuff. So I just wanted to
and may I just add that portrayal of the tradition that we know from Hollywood films of the man getting on the knee and giving the ring to his betrothed. Will you take my De Beers started that. Right. That wasn't a thing. I don't know how far back it goes, but De Beers paid Hollywood to put those scenes.
I think it goes back to the 30s.
Yeah, I know it's before my time, so it's old. It goes back a long time. The same thing with I think it was the cigarette makers from North Carolina.
Yes,
they made smoking. They're responsible for cancer, not just in producing it, but in making it cool. They're as famous. They're as responsible as anyone. They made that cool by paying Hollywood to put it in their movie. So this is, when I talk about racial capitalism, you have to understand they're exploiting workers, paying them nothing, and then they're painting these narratives, right, where everything white is cool, and we define what whiteness is. So it's really a very sinister. There's an author, Jessica Nordell, I think she wrote a book called The Age of Bias, and she says, repeating a lie over and over again doesn't make it the truth. It makes it invisible. That's where we are. The lie is invisible to most of us.
And you can go back to the book Propaganda, Edward Bernays, and how he clearly understood, wrote about, and facilitated the use of Hollywood to control the narrative. Promoting smoking amongst women,
Mm-hmm.
calling the cigarette the freedom torch, that women were able to demonstrate their liberation through smoking.
Right.
I mean, we could go a whole nother way with this conversation, but all of that ties back to the change that we're now seeing in West Africa and how it is dramatically impacting the perspective. And you talked about the people on the ground, and a lot of African leaders are going to have to make some very, very hard decisions really, really fast. They're going to have to be like Bob's Big Boy. Do I stay or do I go?
Right.
Because their folks are going to demand a difference, as they have in Niger, as they are in Burkina Faso, as they are in Mali.
And China.
And Senegal.
And China, I think we need to understand, China, while it might not be the savior of Africa, China is willing to cut Africa a fair deal. And so what I'm saying is that we have all the actors in place. We have China, which can bankroll this economic development, because China is capitalist, but they're not imperialists. And there's a huge difference between capitalism and imperialism. So, again, if I may quote Margaret Thatcher twice in one show, we can do business with China.
Because they're about business.
They're about business. They about that life.
They're about that life. Can you give me a couple more minutes?
Of course.
Okay. Appreciate it.
Anybody else, I'd say no, but you, of course.
Hey, man. Well, I appreciate it. One of the other things that was troubling to me about this meeting with Ramaphosa and Trump today in the Oval Office was he had Retief Goosen and Ernie Els, two South African golfers, and Elon Musk was there as well, of course. But he seemed to pay more deference to Retief Goosen and Elon Musk than he did to Cyril Ramaphosa.
Yeah.
And he asked both Goosen and Els to speak. And when they were done, I was sitting back asking myself, what the hell are they talking about?
Yeah, it's just
what? Bring them to lunch. I'm sure there was a lunch, or there's a dinner tonight.
Right.
Bring them to dinner. Yeah. But parading them out in front of the press, asking them to what?
And I think Black South Africans, again, 80% of the population are going to respond just the way you're responding to that. There's a history in South Africa. Mandela was a great man. He really was a visionary, very smart. But there's a feeling increasingly that, and I'm just going to say this the way it was said to me several times, almost exactly these words, that in negotiating this deal, a peaceful deal, that Black South Africans lost a chance to push the whites into the sea. And what they mean by that is very Fanonian, right? The idea that we would have freed ourselves, our confidence would have grown, we would have accomplished something by pushing our oppressor into the sea. I don't even know if they really mean that, but I think that what they are saying is that you can't really negotiate with your oppressor, right? I mean, you might be able to sort of like cut them a deal, but it's unilateral. Like, they oppressed you, and you can't now say, just like, I mean, I think to some extent this is true of the Palestinians, right? That, Bill Clinton negotiated a deal whereby Israel only had to give back half of what they stole, right? That's not right. That's not really a deal that anyone could accept. And so, again, this is really an inflection point. I think I expect to see and hear a lot of Black South Africans expressing disappointment, or some measure of disappointment, if not in Ramaphosa, then in Trump and in the West, for doing this, to upstaging Ramaphosa, for trying to make him look bad. And I think we're going to see increasingly over the days and months to come, we're going to see not just Black South Africans, but Africans everywhere begin to wash their hands of the West and the United States.
To your point about pushing the Afrikaners into the sea, or pushing the whites into the sea, I think the better descriptor or explanation would have been whiteness,
Yeah,
the mindset.
yeah.
Because we whether it's Clarence Thomas, whether it's Cory Booker, we in this country have the problem of the mindset of whiteness, and that has less to do with white people than it does with the mindset of white supremacy. And to your point about negotiating with the Palestinians and the Zionists, to your point, how do you negotiate? How do you come to a peaceful long-term settlement with someone whose stated objective is your extermination?
Right.
How do you negotiate that?
Right. Yeah. And to your point, you're right. Because if anyone who's ever been to South Africa, they will be amazed. Like the woman the academic we first started talking about on this show, how many people like that and their relationships with blacks, which is really very genuine and affectionate. Black South Africans. I mean, the idea of them killing white farmers willy-nilly is just preposterous, right? They are very smart people, and they understand this a white identity. And I'm going to give one example because I think it's so profound. I mentioned one of the stories I'm proudest of that I wrote when I was in Washington, in South Africa, as a Washington Post correspondent, which is a story about class differences in South Africa between blacks. I was really very proud of that story. The other one was a story about a young white woman from California who attended Stanford named Amy Beale. Amy Beale was a Rhodes Scholar, I think she was. She went there right before the first elections in 1994. She was working in Cape Town in the township. She was a comrade. I mean, black people really loved her. But there was this violence that was being drummed up by the apartheid government as they were going out, trying to divide and conquer the blacks once again. And she was stabbed by these two black teenagers in the township. She was stabbed one night on a street corner, just in this wave of violence. The story, though, and she did die, but the story, she was stabbed right under her arm, in her heart, basically. The story, though, is that when she was stabbed, that community, I mean, it was almost like a commando operation. They all jumped up to how do we save Amy? And there was a taxi driver. They waved down a taxi driver, put her in the car, and they say he drove like a bat out of hell. And anyway, the story that I wrote about Amy Beale, because her parents had come to South Africa after her death, they started a foundation. They were really good people. They were influenced by Madiba magic, as they called post-apartheid South Africa, the rainbow country. And this man taxi driver, who was, I think he might have been colored, which is to say he was black, like Obama would be black. He developed a drinking problem because even though everyone says he drove like a bat out of hell to get her to the hospital, but she had been stabbed in her heart though, and he couldn't get there in time. But it messed with his head that he said I should take on a right there instead of the left, and that really cost me like 20. And it really messed him up to the point that he became an alcoholic. Anyway, the point I'm making is he joined the Amy Beale Foundation that her parents had started, and they gave him a job. And he told me about how, I really understood that saving this woman's life, this white woman's life, was a testament to our humanity, right? People don't understand. Black South Africans, we're a higher form of humanity because of our struggle. You find your strength to struggle. And I really wanted to save this young woman. She was a comrade. That speaks to Black South Africans and this foolishness you saw today where Donald Trump is talking about you're killing what? That's just crazy. I mean, it's really, it's a blasphemy, really. There's no better people on earth than Black South Africans. No better people on earth.
One of the other telling, to me, very, very telling elements to this was it wasn't covered on MSNBC. Not live.
No, I didn't know that. Know that.
It might have been on CNN. I watched it on the BBC.
That's where I watched it. It's on right now. Yeah.
I watched it on the BBC.
Oh, I did not know that.
And the BBC had it on for an hour.
Mm.
And then after that, there was the show that came on after whatever show was covering it. They did interviews with South African journalists and British journalists about Trump ambushing Ramaphosa.
That was terrible. That was just terrible.
But I didn't see anything on American network media about it.
What Trump did was the equivalent of Khrushchev banging his shoe. This was worse, really,
right?
Because first it was televised, right? But that's what this is, and probably is worse than that, because this, I think, is really going to be a game changer. I really do think we're going to see a different South Africa and a different Africa after this point.
Jon Jeter, as always, my brother. Quickly, your book, Class War in America. Let the audience know what the underlying premise of the book is, and why they need to read this.
Well, Class War in America: How the Elites Divide the Nation by Asking, "Are you a worker or are you white?" is the history of this country, certainly since the end of the Civil War. And it speaks, I write about these cycles in American history, usually they're like biblical epochs of 40 years or so, where blacks and whites reconcile to some extent, right? There's always racism, but after the Civil War, radical Reconstruction, blacks and whites working together. There was a political party in Virginia in the late 1870s, early 1880s, 60% black, freedmen, 40% white, poor, working class, farmers, people like that. And they redistributed wealth downward from the rich to the poor, funding education, cutting taxes for the poor, raising them on the rich, cutting the interest rates on bonds paid to rich people to finance roads and things like that. And they really ruled today. And had we continued down that path, we'd be living in the greatest social democracy in the history of the world, probably. But the elites understand that solidarity between black and white working class workers is their foremost existential threat. And they're constantly working to separate us, right? And so we saw it again during World War II, and we're seeing it now. And now I have to say, it feels like it's been more effective than it's ever been before. The idea that black people, and particularly black men, are unfit to participate in public life, let alone lead these sort of transformative movements. So if I can say this, because I think this is an appropriate way to end. I think a lot of white people hear me talk, much as they heard people like Fred Hampton. I'm not comparing myself to Fred Hampton, obviously, but they would hear people talk and think that we hate whites. We do not at all, right? Our enemy, I hate the oppressor, right? Not white people. And that
whiteness.
Exactly. And so I would say, the Hungarians and the Italians and the Irish and the Spaniards and the Brits, they're glorious people. White people, not so much. And that's the message, right? That when you believe, or as James Baldwin said, as long as you believe you're white, there's no hope for you. And really, there's no hope for us, right? Because if we work together, and you can begin and end maybe with this question: why do workers in the United States do 100% of the work for 42% of the haul, right? If you can answer that question, then we might find a common ground, black and white workers, where you understand it ain't because of me, right? It's not because of you, Wilmer Leon. It's because of your racism, which sees me as a threat, a bigger threat to you than this system of racial capitalism. That's the 430 pages in a nutshell.
You're making the point. You're asking that question about why you do 100% of the work for 46% of the 42% of the takeaway. That made me think about the Raphael Warnock town hall meeting, where that Palestinian woman stood up and was talking about his supporting genocide.
Tore him a new one.
And thank you. Yes, 2 new ones, by the way. And there was a black woman sitting behind the Palestinian woman who said show some respect.
Mm-hmm.
And the Palestinian sister said, show some respect, show some respect, make this make sense.
Right, right.
And then she just went off on that point. Make this make sense.
Yeah, yeah.
And because I had framed it another way, explain to me how genocide is right.
Mm-hmm.
Kamala Harris,
Mm-hmm.
explain that to me. Cory Booker, Hakeem Jeffries, please explain to me how, as a Black or African American, I'm supposed to support the reinvasion of Haiti.
Mm-hmm.
Please explain it to me. And if you can explain it to me, then I'm with you.
And if I may, especially since we just celebrated the 100th birthday of Malcolm X, what made Malcolm X great, what made SNCC great, what made the Radical Black Power movement great was that we recognized that to be African means that we are from an oppositional culture in opposition to colonialism and all kinds of oppression. But even more than that, we are sensitive to suffering, right? Mm-hmm. And what's going on, because this is Malcolm got us started on it. And in SNCC, I'm just starting to find out how big a deal SNCC's support of Palestine was. I mean, it really ended the organization because whites said, well, if you're going to support them, you know, we don't have anything to do with you. So, but they were steadfast, right? And that is who we are. That's what it means to be Black. You support the people who are suffering, not the people who are inflicting it. And I just want to end with this. I keep thinking when I saw that Black woman try to chastise that Palestinian woman, I wish I could have been there. I wish I could have been right there, because I would say I had some friends from college who could quote every line from Color Purple, but that line, Celie to Mr. at the dinner table where she pulled the knife on him, right? Until you do right by me, everything you touch is going to crumble. That's the message to the world, and really, seriously, to Black people all over the world. That's our responsibility. Those are our people. And you can talk to me, you can miss me with that stuff about, well, you know, some of them are racist too. Everybody's racist, right? Everybody, even Black people are racist against Black people, right? So that's the state of the world. Our responsibility, we are the saviors of this world, right? We taught Ho Chi Minh how to fight. We taught, Reverend Bonhoeffer, the German cleric who went back and tried to kill Hitler. We are the saviors of the universe, and we can't stop now. So that's all I'll say.
And to that, let me just suggest those of you that have never heard, and when you mentioned SNCC and their understanding and support of Gaza, that to folks, to show you how long this issue has been in our community and how deep it runs in our community, the great trumpeter Lee Morgan, on his first album entitled Indeed, 1956 Blue Note, is a song entitled Gaza.
Oh, I did not know that.
1956 Blue Note.
I love Lee Morgan. I love Lee Morgan.
His first album,
wow.
It's entitled Indeed. And there's a song. In fact, those of you that want to hear it, I'm going to play it Saturday. It's going to be the opening song for my Inside the Issue show on Sirius XM. Go and you can Google it. You can play it. You can stream it. God. It's called Gaza.
I did not know that.
Mm-hmm.
Is it a coincidence that Lee Morgan died at the age of 33? Or was he trying to tell us something?
Unfortunately, the woman that he pissed off.
Right. Yeah. I guess she chose the time of his death, I guess. Right.
Oh,
he got the wrong one.
My brother, Jon Jeter, thank you as always, man. Greatly appreciate the insight. And as always, man, look forward to having you back.
Can't wait. Cannot wait.
Thanks, brother. Thank you. Hey, folks, please subscribe. You can join the Connecting the CTD Club, and for as little as $4.99 a month, and that's one mocha chocolate latte with little foam whipped with cinnamon. And you can support this effort, and much needed, much appreciated. And you can subscribe on YouTube. I don't see that we had any new subscribers today, but you can't do that every day as much as I wish y'all would. Thank you so much for listening to the Connecting the Dots podcast with me, Dr. Wilmer Leon. New episode tomorrow. Misty Winston will join us tomorrow from the Misty Winston Show. Again, please follow, please subscribe through YouTube. Those of you that are watching on other platforms, if you would please go to YouTube and subscribe. Share the show. We are growing. Just not, I'm greedy, so we're not growing as fast as I would like us to. Follow us on social media. All the links are below. Remember that this is where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge. That talk without analysis is just chatter. And we don't chatter here because we are rhetoric-free podcasting. Oh, and by the way, there are no tariffs. When you subscribe to the show, when you contribute to the show, contrary to what Donald Trump wants to do, there are no tariffs assigned to your contribution. We greatly, greatly appreciate it. See y'all tomorrow. Until then, I am Dr. Wilmer Leon. Peace. I'm out.
Connecting the Dots with Dr. Wilmer Leon, where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge.